"That folder doesn't belong to you." He set it on the boardroom table without looking up. "Neither does this building," she said. "Not anymore." He slid a single page toward her. She didn't touch it. "Sign what?" Her voice had the particular edge of a woman who had never once considered she might be wrong. "The transfer agreement." Section 4. She laughed. It was short and clean, the way people laugh when they're certain of something. "You lost your job 8 months ago. You've been sitting in that guest room pretending to consult. What exactly do you think you own?" He didn't answer that. He waited. The man beside her, the one with the architect's tan and the watch that cost more than a teacher's annual salary, shifted in his chair. "Have him removed," Colton Vane said. The security officer who had been standing near the door didn't move. That was when she understood something had shifted. But she didn't yet know what. And she didn't know that the building she was sitting in, the company she had signed her name to 4 months earlier, the parking space in the garage with her initials on it, none of it belonged to her anymore. What did she think she knew about the man sitting across from her? What did any of them think they knew about Graham Ashford? If this is the kind of story that makes you feel something, you're in the right place. Hit subscribe. Real stories live here. Let me go back, because none of this makes sense without it. Graham Ashford grew up in a house where money was discussed in the same hushed register as illness, not something you announced, not something you wore. His grandfather, Wendell, had built a small industrial coating company in southern Ohio starting in 1961, operating it for 31 years before handing it to Graham's father, who had doubled its contracts and quietly held it through 2 recessions. When Graham was 19, his father pressed a brass-cased transit compass into his palm, the kind surveyors once carried in leather belt pouches, and said only, "This tells you where you are, not where people think you are." Graham kept that compass in the left drawer of whatever desk he worked at for the next 22 years, and never once showed it to anyone who hadn't already earned that conversation. The family held their wealth the way old Midwestern families often did, without announcing it, without performing it, without letting it become the first thing a room knew about them. By the time Graham was 34, the parent company had absorbed 2 regional competitors and was generating annual revenue of $3 million, with Graham managing the acquisitions division under a title that said almost nothing, Director of Strategic Development. He drove a 5-year-old gray Volvo. He owned 3 pairs of dress shoes. When people at networking events asked what he did, he said industrial consulting, and let them fill in whatever picture they preferred. He had learned, after a specific and damaging episode at 28, that announcing the full scope of what his family controlled was an invitation for a particular kind of relationship he had no interest in sustaining. That episode had involved a woman named Dana, not a villain, just someone who had confused his net worth for a personality and his family's assets for a shared future she was entitled to. When he ended it, she had taken 3 items from his apartment and told 6 mutual contacts that he was not what he seemed. She wasn't wrong, he just hadn't been hiding something sinister. He had been protecting something real. He met Serena Calloway at an industry fundraiser in Columbus on a Thursday in March, 7 years before the day he would set that folder on the boardroom table. She was there with a client. She worked in marketing strategy for a mid-sized agency, and she had the specific social fluency of a person who had been trained since childhood to read a room quickly. She was warm where Dana had been calculating, curious where most people were performing curiosity, and when Graham mentioned industrial coating without the usual apology most people expected, she had asked a genuine follow-up question about the chemistry of powder coat finishes that caught him entirely off guard. He drove her to her hotel afterward. They talked in the parking structure for 90 minutes. He did not tell her about the company. He told her about the compass. She had held it carefully, turning it in the orange light coming through the concrete slats. "Your grandfather's," she said. Not a question. She handed it back without any ceremony, which was the right instinct. And the instinct that told him something real was possible here. They were married 14 months later at a small venue in Granville, Ohio. Her mother, Renata Calloway, attended with the particular expression of a woman who had decided in advance that her daughter had undershot. Renata worked the room at the reception with the efficiency of someone cataloging grievances for later use. She shook Graham's hand once, said lovely ceremony, and directed the rest of her attention toward the catering staff's organizational shortcomings. The first 3 years of the marriage were, without qualification, the period Graham would later describe, not to journalists, not to anyone outside of one conversation with his attorney Oliver Reed, as the best of his life. They bought a house in a neighborhood that was pleasant without being showy. A 1940s colonial with a deep backyard and a detached garage Graham converted into a workshop. Serena kept her clients, kept her agency work, kept the part of her that had asked about powder coat chemistry with genuine interest. Graham kept his quiet, kept his title, kept the Volvo. They had dinner with friends on Saturdays, hiked on Sunday mornings, argued occasionally about small things, and repaired those arguments before Tuesday. He still did not tell her the full scope of the company. He kept meaning to. He kept waiting for a moment that felt right, and then the moment kept not arriving, and then the pattern was set. And then the pattern felt impossible to break without explanation, and the explanation felt like an accusation of her motives, even though her motives then seemed entirely clean. The fracture did not arrive like a break. It arrived like a change in humidity, imperceptible on any given day, undeniable across a season. Renata Calloway began spending more time in Columbus the year Serena's agency was acquired by a larger firm, which restructured Serena's role from strategy lead to account management, a demotion delivered with corporate language that technically changed nothing while materially changing everything. Serena absorbed this with the practiced resilience of someone who had always found her footing quickly. But the footing she found was different this time. Renata, visiting for a long weekend that stretched into 11 days, brought with her the specific vocabulary of social comparison that Graham had encountered before in certain circles and learned to avoid. So-and-so's husband runs a fund now. Lauren and Pierce just closed on a place in Hilton Head. I'm not saying anything, sweetheart, just that at your age, your father and I had already. Serena did not take the bait those first few weeks. She deflected with warmth and humor, the way she had deflected similar language at the fundraiser where Graham had met her. But something had shifted in the efficiency of her deflections. She started deflecting faster, which meant she was anticipating the pressure rather than encountering it fresh. And when you start anticipating pressure, you've already, on some level, given it a seat at the table. Colton Veen appeared 11 weeks into this period, and his arrival was not dramatic. It rarely is with men like Colton Veen. He was introduced through Renata, which was the first detail Graham filed away. Renata had met him at a charity auction benefiting a children's hospital. Renata Calloway attended charity events the way generals survey terrain, and had found him, she said, extraordinary. She used that word 3 times across the dinner where she introduced him to Graham and Serena at an Italian restaurant on the north side. Colton Veen was 41, with the kind of face that photographed well without being conventionally attractive, a practiced ease in rooms he'd never been in before, and a habit of leaning back in his chair slightly when he spoke, as if waiting for the room to catch up to him. He described himself as a venture and development strategist, which told Graham precisely nothing concrete. He wore a Breguet Marine chronograph worth approximately $22,000, which told Graham rather more. I've been looking at some assets in the consumer goods sector, Colton said over the appetizers, addressing Serena rather than Graham with the particular warmth of someone who had decided which person at the table was worth cultivating. Your background in brand strategy is exactly what a certain kind of acquisition needs on the front end. I keep finding companies with strong fundamentals and weak identity. That's a solvable problem. Serena's interest sharpened. Graham watched it sharpen, the way he had watched things sharpen in many rooms over many years. And he noted that the sharpening was partly professional and partly something else. Not attraction, not yet, but attention. Attention of the kind that forms when someone reflects your professional self back at you more clearly than the person you live with does. Graham said little at that dinner. He picked at a branzino and asked Colton one question about his portfolio's primary focus areas, and received an answer built entirely from category names without a single concrete company mentioned. He noted this. He noted that Colton had arrived in a rented McLaren that was visible from the restaurant window and had mentioned, between the appetizers and the main course, that he was between properties while his Scottsdale place was being renovated. He noted that Renata watched Colton with the careful satisfaction of someone who had made an introduction she expected to be thanked for. Graham said nothing. He finished his wine, helped Serena with her coat at the end of the evening, shook Colton Vane's hand in the parking lot with a grip that communicated nothing, and drove home. He stayed quiet through the exit from downtown, quiet through the highway, quiet until Serena said, unprompted, "He's impressive, isn't he?" And Graham said, "He's something," and she laughed in a way that didn't reach the question, and that was how the erosion introduced its central character, not with a crash, but with a laugh that floated free of anything underneath it. Over the following 6 weeks, Colton Vane became a recurring presence at dinners that Graham was sometimes invited to and sometimes heard about after the fact. Serena described these evenings with the careful specificity of someone who wanted to be transparent and had chosen transparency as a preemptive strategy. Graham listened. He asked fair questions. He was not unreasonable. But he noticed that Colton now texted Serena directly, that the texts arrived in the early morning before Graham was awake, and that Serena had started keeping her phone screen down on the kitchen counter in a way she had never done in 7 years of marriage. He noticed that she had begun talking about a project, undefined, future tense, professional in character, and that Colton's name appeared in these conversations the way a piece of furniture appears, present, functional, not requiring explanation. He noticed that when Renata visited now, she no longer cataloged Graham's professional inadequacies. She had stopped bothering, which was worse. Graham came home from a site visit in Pittsburgh on a Tuesday in October to find that Serena had rearranged the home office, moving his secondary monitor to the garage workshop and replacing it with a whiteboard covered in brand architecture diagrams. She said she needed the space for the project. She said it with the flat tone of someone who had rehearsed the sentence and was delivering it at the scheduled time. He moved his monitor without comment. He set it up in the garage, next to the workbench, under the single fluorescent tube that buzzed slightly on the left end. He sat in that garage for 40 minutes that night while the temperature dropped. And he felt something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but occupied the space between them precisely. The discovery happened on a Friday morning in November, on a day when the sky was the particular white of Midwestern winter that carries no texture, only flatness. Graham had come back early from a meeting that ran short. A zoning discussion with a city planner in Worthington that concluded 40 minutes ahead of schedule. He entered through the garage, which was his habit, and as he came through the mudroom and into the kitchen, he saw that Serena's laptop was open on the kitchen island and that she had left it open when she went upstairs to take a call. This was not unusual. What was unusual was the browser window visible on the screen. He did not intend to read it. He stopped moving when a particular phrase caught his peripheral vision, the way certain words in a room stop a person even when they're not looking. His name adjacent to a dollar figure. Adjacent to the words primary asset disclosure in a document that appeared to be a draft communication addressed to a legal office. He stood absolutely still for 4 seconds. Then he leaned forward and read it. The document was a legal consultation memo partially composed addressed to a firm in Cleveland that specialized in marital asset division. It was not a completed filing, it was an inquiry. But the inquiry was specific and detailed in a way that required research, preparation, and the kind of legal vocabulary that comes from a prior conversation with an attorney rather than a casual internet search. It referenced Graham's employment status, current income, nominal consulting fees, and listed the house, the joint accounts, and 2 investment accounts as marital assets. What it did not reference, because Serena did not know it existed in full, was the company. The parent company and its subsidiaries held in a structure that Graham's grandfather's attorneys had engineered across 3 decades and which Graham had never fully disclosed to Serena because he had kept meaning to and kept not doing it, and now, reading this document, understood what his silence had cost. That was the personal betrayal. She was preparing to leave, and she had been preparing with enough time and intent to have already drafted inquiry memos to attorneys. But the financial betrayal was still below the surface. Graham straightened, noted the time, 11:14 a.m., and went upstairs to his office on the pretense of retrieving a file. He heard Serena in the master bedroom, still on her call, laughing at something in the particular relaxed register she used only in conversations she considered entirely private. He sat at his desk, opened his own laptop, and began to trace 3 transactions he had noticed the previous month across a shared household account. Transactions he had logged mentally, but not yet examined. because he had not yet had a reason to look directly at them rather than around them. The transactions were $4,400, $6,100, and $11,700 spread across a 19-day window in October, posted to two vendors he did not recognize. He ran both vendor names through a state business registry search that took him 11 minutes. The first was a dormant LLC registered in Delaware with a Columbus address. The second was a DBA registered 4 months earlier under a name that was a variation of Serena's middle name, Renata's choice of middle name for her, as it turned out. Both entities had the same registered agent. He sat with that for a long moment. Then, he called Oliver Reed. Oliver Reed had been Graham's family's attorney for 9 years. He had handled 3 of the company's acquisitions and the estate documentation when Graham's father passed, and he answered on the second ring in the measured tone of a man who received important calls frequently enough to stay level through all of them. Graham described what he had found without editorializing, the way his father had taught him to present information before interpreting it. Oliver listened. When Graham finished, Oliver said, "Don't touch the laptop. Don't change anything in your accounts. Don't indicate to Serena that you've seen any of it. Call me from a number she's not familiar with after 6 tonight and bring me the vendor names." Graham wrote nothing down. He closed his laptop, descended the stairs, hung his coat in the mudroom, and walked into the kitchen. Serena had come down while he was upstairs. She was at the kitchen island with her laptop now closed, making a cup of tea, and she said, "You're back early," in a tone that was entirely ordinary. He said the meeting ran short. He poured himself a glass of water. They stood in the same kitchen for 6 minutes talking about nothing consequential. And he felt something colder than anger while he did it. A kind of absolute precision about what he was dealing with and what would be required to deal with it correctly. He called Oliver Reed from a gas station payphone at 6:22 p.m. Oliver said, "We need 2 things before anything else: forensic accounting on those entities, and a full corporate structure report on the parent company that documents exactly what you hold and what's protected. I know a woman who does this work. Her name is Cecilia Frost. She's going to need 3 weeks. I'll give her what she needs," Graham said. "You'll also need to not give anything away in the meantime," Oliver said. "I understand that, Graham." Oliver paused. "How long has this been building?" Graham thought about the whiteboard in the home office, the phone screen down on the counter, the dinners he heard about after the fact. "Long enough," he said. He hung up the payphone, sat in the Volvo for a moment, and then drove home. Cecilia Frost worked from an office above a Up store in Dublin, Ohio, with 2 associate analysts and a practice that specialized in forensic asset tracing for litigation support. She was 53, with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had been methodical since childhood, and she met Graham the following Thursday afternoon in Oliver Reed's conference room with a yellow legal pad and no laptop. She wrote by hand in a script so small it was almost illegible to anyone else. She asked Graham 47 questions over 90 minutes, most of them about the timeline of the corporate structure, the signatory history on the joint household accounts, and whether Serena had ever been present at any of the 3 acquisition closings. Graham answered all 47 accurately and completely, including the fact that Serena had not known the full scope of what he held. Cecilia wrote a note at the bottom of the second page and underlined it once. She did not show Graham what it said. "I'll need the last 4 years of transaction records from those joint accounts," she said, "and the LLC documents when you obtain them." "How long?" Graham asked. 3 weeks if everything cooperates. 4 if the Delaware filing is buried. She called him 16 days later on a Tuesday morning. "I need you to come in," she said. "Bring Oliver." The picture that Cecilia laid out across Oliver Reed's conference table that afternoon was assembled from 214 transaction records, 6 entity documents, 2 email chains that had been forwarded to the Delaware LLC's registered mailbox using an address Graham had unknowingly been copied on in a mass vendor communication 8 months earlier, and 1 wire transfer confirmation that bore Serena's electronic signature on an authorization he had never seen. The 2 vendor entities were not Serena's Constructions alone. Colton Vane's name appeared as a manager on the Delaware LLC. The arrangement, Cecilia explained in the measured tones of someone presenting evidence rather than performing outrage, was straightforward. Serena was moving household funds that came from the joint account into which Graham's consulting fees were deposited through the two entities, which were passing the money onward to a third account registered to a holding company controlled by Colton. The total moved across 19 months was $38,700, not a ruinous number. But the structure was unmistakably deliberate. It required entity formation, coordinated timing, and the presumption that Graham was too professionally diminished, too disengaged, to check. Colton Vane, Cecilia continued, setting a second folder on the table, had done this before. She had located two prior civil matters, one in Arizona and one in Georgia, where similar structures had been used against spouses of individuals with assets that were not publicly disclosed. In both prior cases, the approach had been the same: introduce through a mutual social contact. Develop a professional relationship with the spouse, establish financial conduits under the cover of a business partnership, and use the resulting documentation to demonstrate income to third parties while positioning for access to the primary asset through either a marital dissolution or a direct business transaction once the spouse was sufficiently isolated from their support network. Colton Vane was not romantically interested in Serena Calloway. He was interested in whatever Graham Ashford actually owned, and he had, through Renata Calloway's social network, identified Graham as someone who owned more than he showed. Graham sat with that for a long moment. Oliver Reed said nothing. Cecilia capped her pen. "There's more," Graham said. "There is," Cecilia confirmed. 4 months prior to the meeting in Oliver's office, Serena had incorporated a new entity in Ohio under a name that combined a variation of her maiden name with the word capital. She had listed herself as sole officer. She had done this without Graham's knowledge, and she had used that entity 3 weeks after its formation to make an offer. Through Colton Vane's holding company as the intermediary financing vehicle on a mid-sized brand management agency in Columbus that was in distressed sale. The agency had 11 employees and $1 million in annual revenue. The offer had been accepted in principle. The closing was scheduled for 8 weeks from the current date, pending final financing confirmation. The financing, Cecilia said, was contingent on Colton Vane's holding company securing a collateral commitment, and the collateral Colton intended to pledge, in documentation that Cecilia had obtained through a public records request on the holding company's prior transaction filings, was described in the draft agreement as anticipated marital asset distributions from a pending dissolution. Colton Vane was planning to finance a business acquisition using money he expected to extract from Graham Ashford's assets in a divorce proceeding. Graham picked up the brass compass from the left pocket of his jacket. He had started carrying it again 3 weeks into this for a reason he hadn't examined, and turned it once in his hand. He set it on the conference table. "How long before he needs the collateral confirmation?" Graham asked. 7 weeks, Cecilia said. "Then we have time to do this correctly," Graham said. He was tempted that afternoon, in the parking structure beneath Oliver's building, to drive directly to the restaurant where Serena and Colton were meeting. Oliver's assistant had located the calendar invite through the email chain, forwarded inadvertently to the vendor mailbox, and to walk in and put the folder on the table between them. He sat in the Volvo for 11 minutes with that temptation, and then drove in the opposite direction. He had built too much structure to dismantle it with a scene, and there were 247 employees across the parent company's 3 operating facilities. People who had families and mortgages and tenure going back in some cases to his grandfather's era, and whatever he did next would send shockwaves through an ownership structure that those 247 people depended on. He would not allow his anger, and it was anger by now, clear and specific, to put them at risk. He drove back to the garage workshop, sat at his workbench, and spent 2 hours repairing a lamp that had needed attention for 3 months. He worked with the methodical focus he had inherited from his father, hands occupied, mind moving through the sequence of what came next. Oliver would file the corporate structure documentation with the court. Cecilia would complete the forensic report. The closing on the Columbus agency was scheduled for a Friday, and there was an industry gala, the annual Columbus Commerce Awards dinner, held at the State House Event Center, at which both the distressed agency's outgoing owner and 3 of the parent company's major clients would be present, taking place 6 days before that closing date. Graham thought about that gala for a long time. Then he called Oliver Reed and told him what he wanted to do. Oliver said, "That's elegant." Graham said, "It's just correct." The Columbus Commerce Awards Gala was held on a Friday evening in the third week of January. The State House Event Center had been dressed for it, round tables under pendant lighting, a stage at the far end with a podium flanked by the logos of the evening's sponsors. The usual architecture of a room designed to make professional achievement feel communal and earned. Graham arrived alone at 6:47 p.m. in a dark suit he had owned for 4 years, carrying no folder and no briefcase. He checked in at the registration table, accepted his name badge, and found his assigned table near the center of the room. Oliver Reed was already seated at the same table, 2 chairs to Graham's left. Cecilia Frost was at a table 12 feet away, near the sponsor's display, with a glass of water and a folder she did not open. The distressed agency's outgoing owner, a man named Richard Osei, who had been managing his company's sale with exhausted dignity, was at a table near the stage. Graham had spoken to Richard Osei twice by phone over the previous 3 weeks, in conversations that Oliver had facilitated, and Richard knew what was coming. He had also received, through a separate legal process, a full accounting of what Colton Vane's holding company had represented to him during the acquisition process. Representations that were, Cecilia's report documented, materially false on 3 points. Serena arrived at 7:04 p.m. in a dress Graham recognized as one she had purchased in December and not mentioned. Colton Vane was at her shoulder in a charcoal jacket with a lapel pin that cost roughly what Graham spent on groceries in 2 months. Renata Calloway was 2 steps behind them, surveying the room with the proprietary assessment of a woman attending an event she had helped engineer. They were seated at a table near the sponsor's display that happened to place Colton Vane with a direct sightline to Cecilia Frost, though Colton would not have known who Cecilia Frost was. The evening's program ran its first 40 minutes without incident. Awards were given. Remarks were made. Richard Osei received an industry longevity recognition that he accepted with the quiet grace of a man who had decided to hold himself together for one more evening. Graham ate his dinner and spoke pleasantly to the woman beside him, who worked in regional economic development and had interesting things to say about infrastructure funding mechanisms. At 8:22 p.m., during the interval between the formal program and the social portion of the evening, Colton Vane came to Graham's table. He arrived with the particular ease of a man who had decided to control a scene before it could develop, and he extended a hand to Graham with a smile that was warm on the surface and entirely absent beneath it. "Graham, good to see you." Graham shook his hand. "Colton, I wasn't sure you'd be here tonight. I've been coming to this event for 11 years, Graham said. Colton glanced at Oliver Reed, who was occupied with his phone. "Your wife mentioned you were doing some consulting work. How's that going?" "Steadily," Graham said. Colton tilted his head slightly, the way men do when they're waiting for a moment to arrive. "I want you to know, the project Serena and I have been developing, it's a real opportunity for her. She has exceptional instincts. The agency acquisition makes sense on every level." Graham looked at him for a moment. "Which agency?" Colton's expression shifted by approximately 3 millimeters. "The Osei Group," he said. Richards decided to transition out. "I know Richard," Graham said. "Good man." "It is what it is," Colton said. "It really is," Graham said. Serena arrived at the table 30 seconds later, having noticed the conversation from across the room. Her expression carried the specific alertness of a person monitoring 2 separate situations simultaneously. She stood at Colton's shoulder and said, "Graham, I didn't know you were planning to come tonight." "I come every year," Graham said. "Right," she held his gaze for a moment. "Colton and I were just going to get drinks." "I know," Graham said. "I was hoping you'd stay for a few minutes." He said this in a tone that was entirely conversational, the kind of tone that does not telegraph anything, and both Serena and Colton remained. Oliver Reed set down his phone. Richard Osei appeared at the edge of their table with 2 of the evening's other sponsors at his side. Graham had asked him for 3 minutes via text at 8:15, and he placed a legal-size envelope on the table without ceremony. "Mr. Vane," Richard said, "I received documentation this afternoon from my attorney regarding the representations your holding company made during our letter of intent process. I'm withdrawing from the sale agreement. My attorney will have formal notice to yours by 9 a.m. tomorrow." He said this calmly. with the exhausted decency of a man who had decided at some point that he was done absorbing other people's dishonesty. Then he nodded to Graham and walked back toward his table. Colton said nothing for 4 seconds. "What is that?" Serena asked. Her voice was level, but she had shifted her weight, and Graham knew that shift, it was the way she moved when something wasn't adding up, and she hadn't yet decided whether to push or retreat. Graham reached inside his jacket and removed a single folded document. He placed it on the table the way he'd placed the folder on the boardroom table in the cold opening, without drama, without ceremony, the way you set down something heavy that you've been carrying too long. That, he said, is a summary of what Cecilia has documented across the last 19 months. It covers the 2 Delaware entities, the $38,700 in transferred funds, the holding company's collateral filing, and Mr. Vane's prior civil matters in Arizona and Georgia. He looked at Colton. "You've had 6 years' worth of assumptions about what I own. Tonight seems like the right time to correct them." Colton picked up the document. His face did the thing faces do when the math stops working, a subtle, involuntary recalibration that no amount of practiced ease can fully conceal. "I'm not sure what you think you're doing," Colton said. "I'm not doing anything," Graham said. "Oliver?" Oliver Reed set a second document on the table. It was the corporate structure filing, 43 pages, tabbed, bearing the company's full legal name and the subsidiary list and the revenue figures from the previous fiscal year, which totaled $51.7 million. On the cover page was a single highlighted line showing Graham Ashford's majority ownership stake. Serena picked it up. She read the cover page. She read it again. The color left her face not in a rush but in degrees, the way it does when a person is processing something large and sequential rather than something sudden. "The building," she said. Not a sentence. Just those 2 words. "Is mine," Graham confirmed. She looked at him. "How long?" "Since my grandfather incorporated it in 1961, Graham said. "My father held it. Now I do." "You never said." She stopped. "No," he said. "I didn't." She set the document down. She looked at Colton. And the look she gave him was not the look of a woman whose plan had been interrupted. It was the look of a woman who was beginning to understand what the plan had actually been and what role she had been assigned in it and who had assigned it. "You knew," she said to Colton. Her voice was very flat. He said nothing. His hand was still on the summary document. He had the expression of a man calculating exit options. "You already knew he owned something," she said. "That's why," she stopped again. "That's why he introduced himself through your mother," Graham said gently. "That's why the professional project was always framed around needing access to an acquisition. That's why the collateral in his financing agreement was described as anticipated marital asset distributions. He needed me to have less than I appeared to have, and he needed you to help him find out what I actually had." Colton Veen set the document down. He stood up, straightened his jacket with the unconscious precision of a man returning to a practiced surface. "I'd like to speak with my attorney," he said. "I imagine you would," Oliver Reed said. "He'll be hearing from mine as well. Tonight, most likely." Renata Calloway appeared at the table's edge at this point, having worked her way across the room with the instinct of someone who can sense when the architecture of an evening has changed. She looked at the documents on the table. She looked at Colton's face. She looked at Serena. She said nothing, which was the first time in Graham's experience that Renata Calloway had attended a social event and said absolutely nothing. Colton left the table without a handshake. He moved toward the exit at the pace of a man who is declining to appear rushed, and he reached the lobby and he was gone from the room in under 2 minutes. The legal process that followed was neither fast nor simple, but it had the particular momentum of documentation that is thorough enough to leave very little room for counter-narrative. Cecilia Frost's forensic report was filed with the 10th District Court in Columbus on the first Monday of February. It was 214 pages. Organized by entity, with transaction summaries and a final section that documented the full timeline of fund transfers and their downstream movement into Colton Vane's holding company accounts. The 2 Delaware entities were dissolved by court order 6 weeks later. The $38,700 was subject to recovery proceedings, which Oliver managed through a separate civil filing that named both Serena and the holding company as respondents. Colton Vane retained a private attorney in Cincinnati who specialized in complex asset litigation. His first strategy was to argue that the financial arrangement between himself and Serena had been a legitimate business partnership agreement with no intent to defraud, and that Graham's corporate holdings, being undisclosed during the marriage, could not form the basis of a fraud claim since Serena had acted in good faith with respect to the assets she had known about. This argument required the court to believe that Serena had not known the entities were passing money to Vane's holding company, a position that became difficult to sustain when Cecilia's report was entered into evidence, specifically the section that included an email thread between Serena's newly formed capital entity and Vane's holding company's manager dated 7 months into the arrangement, in which the word distribution schedule appeared 4 times. Colton's second strategy was to approach the Osai Group acquisition through a different financing vehicle, a private equity contact he had in Phoenix who had backed 2 of his prior projects. This strategy collapsed within 3 weeks when the Phoenix contact, upon performing due diligence on Vane's litigation history, declined to participate. The Arizona civil matter that Cecilia had identified, a 2019 case involving a similar asset extraction scheme against a manufacturing family in Scottsdale, had not resulted in a judgment against Vane, but the documentation of the scheme was public record, and the Phoenix contact read it and called Vane to decline in a conversation that Vane described to his attorney as unhelpful. Richard Osai's sale of the Osai Group proceeded through a different buyer, a regional holding company with a legitimate balance sheet, and closed at a price that was 11% higher than what Vane's entity had offered. Richard sent Graham a brief text message the day it closed that said only "thank you." Graham saved it. Renata Callaway retained her own attorney in March, which was a surprise to no one for the purposes of navigating her own potential exposure in the matter, whether her introduction of Colton Vane to her daughter and her sustained social facilitation of his access to the household constituted knowing participation in the scheme or merely enthusiastic negligence. Oliver Reed described this, in one of his rare moments of dry commentary, as an interesting distinction that the court may eventually find unpersuasive. Renata's attorney negotiated her into a deposition rather than a named respondent status. She gave 3 hours of testimony in a conference room in April. Graham did not attend. He had no interest in watching Renata Callaway explain herself. He had already heard everything she had to say across 7 years of dinners. The marital dissolution itself was processed separately from the fraud case, and it took 9 months, the standard duration for an asset structure of the company's complexity, requiring independent valuation by 2 court-appointed experts and 3 rounds of document exchange between Oliver Reed and Serena's attorney. A woman from a downtown Columbus firm who was meticulous and fair and with whom Oliver had a professional relationship that made the process less adversarial than it might otherwise have been. Graham did not seek to penalize Serena beyond the recovery of the transferred funds and the legal costs of the proceeding. He did not pursue the full civil exposure available to him. He had instructed Oliver, in the parking structure below Oliver's office 9 months earlier, to pursue what was just, and to stop there, not because he felt charitable towards Serena, but because there were 247 people at 3 operating facilities who depended on the company's stability, and a protracted legal war over a marriage would have destabilized things in ways that would ultimately fall on people who had nothing to do with any of it. Oliver had asked him at the time whether he was certain about that limit. Graham had said yes. Oliver had written it down. The dissolution was finalized in November. Serena received the house in Granville. Graham had suggested it, and it was accepted, along with a structured payment for her share of the marital assets. Calculated against the disclosed portion of the estate rather than the full corporate value, since the company's full holdings had not been disclosed during the marriage and both parties' attorneys had agreed to a settlement structure that reflected this complexity without litigating it further. She retained her professional practice. She returned to agency work at a new firm on the east side of Columbus, a smaller operation with fewer politics and a client list that she was building from scratch. Graham heard this through Oliver, who heard it through the professional grapevine, and he noted it without comment. Colton Vane's exposure in the civil matter eventually produced a judgment of $44.200 in damages against his holding company, the transferred funds plus legal costs plus a modest punitive finding, which the holding company paid through an asset liquidation that included the Scottsdale property, which turned out not to have been undergoing renovation at the time of the Italian restaurant dinner. It had been listed for sale. The Breguet watch appeared in a secondary market watch dealer's inventory in Phoenix 3 months after the judgment was entered. Oliver's assistant found the listing during an unrelated search and forwarded it to Oliver as a curiosity. Oliver did not forward it to Graham. He mentioned it in passing at a lunch and Graham said, "Good, someone will get use out of it." Renata Calloway sent Graham one text message 7 months after the dissolution was finalized. It said, "I hope you know I didn't understand what he was." Graham read it twice. He did not respond. He considered for a moment what response would be honest without being cruel, and then decided that the absence of response was the most honest thing he could offer her. He deleted the message. He moved on. The parent company in the fiscal year following the dissolution posted revenue of $54. $2 million, the highest in its history. Graham promoted 2 regional managers to senior director roles that had been structurally overdue for 4 years and should have been addressed sooner. He moved his office from the satellite location he had been using for 11 years to the main facility in Marysville, where he could walk the floor and know the names of the people he was responsible for, which his grandfather had believed was the minimum obligation of anyone who held ownership of something that employed others. He still drove the gray Volvo, though he replaced it in March with a slightly newer gray Volvo of the same model. The garage workshop in the Granville house had been returned to Serena with the property, and Graham had moved to a smaller place nearer the Marysville facility, a second-floor apartment above a hardware store. With good natural light and a workbench he built himself along the eastern wall. On the workbench in the left corner, he kept the brass transit compass his grandfather had given his father and his father had given him. He did not keep it in a drawer anymore. He let it sit where he could see it. He thought about the compass sometimes on the drives between Marysville and Columbus. The way his grandfather had handed it to his father without sentiment. Just a tool, just a thing that told you where you were relative to where you thought you were. Not where people thought you were, not where a room's expectations of you placed you, where you actually were. He had known, for most of the marriage, where he actually was. He had just made the error of assuming that the people around him knew the same territory he did, that they were navigating by the same markers with the same instrument. They were not. They were navigating by status and comparison and the social architecture that Renata Calloway had been building around her daughter since childhood. And Graham had moved through that architecture for 7 years assuming it was neutral terrain. It was not neutral. It had been shaping things long before he arrived. He did not regret staying as long as he did. He had genuinely loved Serena in the years when she had been the woman who held a stranger's compass in a parking structure and asked a real question about powder coat chemistry. That woman had existed. She had been corroded by pressure and isolation and the specific social gravity that Colton Veen had known how to apply. Graham did not fully blame her. He also did not minimize what she had done. Both things were true and did not require resolution. If this story stayed with you, it's worth asking what you're actually carrying, and who in your life knows the full weight of it. The people who deserve to know you don't need the performance. They need the compass. They need the thing that tells you where you are. Every week, stories like this find their way here. Real accounts of people who held their ground while the people around them bet they wouldn't. If you haven't subscribed yet, this is where those stories live. And if this one reached you, share it. Someone in your circle needs to hear it. Have you ever had to choose between staying quiet and speaking up, when staying quiet was the harder and more necessary thing? Leave that in the comments. We read them. We'll see you in the next one.